now recording, and we're going to, hi guys virtually, I hope you guys are doing well. I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to continue our discussion about specific learning disabilities. So on Tuesday, we talked about psychological processes that have an effect on the 8 areas of learning disabilities. Now, here's the thing I want you guys to do is go in, review that information, because normally we'd manipulate it and do stuff in groups and do some activities that way, but this environment's not letting us do that. I just want you to have some awareness of it all, and we'll start throwing some interventions toward that are specifically geared to that psychological process. Basically, on the test for this module, which is in a couple weeks, we will there'll be a question or two over psychological processes. So you'll need to go in and remember that information. So that'll be good. All right, so we're looking at the specific learning disability categories, and we talked about the definition, we did the psychological process activity. Now then, in an appropriate social distancing piece, I want you to just discuss with somebody that's close enough that you can talk to them. Is learning to speak different than learning to read? They both deal with words and language, but are they the same? Are they different? And how would they be different? So let's take 3 minutes and talk to each other about that. You guys can join in and converse wherever you remember, maintain appropriate social distancing guidelines. Okay. And you guys virtually can talk among yourself. You, yourself, and I, or something. I don't know. So 15 seconds, and then we'll, and then I want you to share out as best you can. Thank your neighbors for sharing. And all right, so tell me, what did you guys think? Is learning to speak different than learning to read, or is it the same thing? How is it different?
Well, our group talked about, like, if a student has a speech impediment or hearing impairment, they're going to learn to speak completely differently than how, like, someone who doesn't does. So that alone makes speech from 2 different people different.
Okay. So how, and culturally, that's an issue too, I kind of mentioned that earlier, about cultural references and things like that has an impact on how we hear and understand and speak. And then it does translate to reading, and can you read something and kind of identify the cultural piece too. So it's interesting. So maybe somebody, the way that they make the sounds out of their mouth is different. It's so funny is that I have lived in Texas for since 1983. So I've lived here longer than I lived in California, but I've never got a Texas accent. But both my parents were Texans, and they had a very distinct Texas accent. They were West Texans, and so it's kind of funny that I never got one. So I guess that California ingrained thing stayed with me. So it's kind of, and I'd say I have a Texafornian accent. But it's funny, isn't it? So how else is reading? Other thoughts? Reading, speaking and reading, is it similar, different? What?
Kids can mimic our speech. They can say all these complicated words even if they don't know how to read them or how they're spelled.
So expressive vocabulary and actually your receptive vocabulary is much grander than your expressive vocabulary. And so you understand better than you do explaining sometimes. So that's an interesting thing. So yeah. So you'll see in this video that we're going to watch of Dr. Souza, in your Souza book, How the Special Brain Learns, he uses the word prestidigitation. And that would be a hard word to read, but then what does it mean and all this stuff, and how often would you ever use prestidigitation in a conversation? And so it's kind of an interesting process. So reading takes more processes, brain processing, than speaking does. Do you agree with that statement? So it's all about interpreting symbols. Think about this. Language is a amalgamation of symbols that have meaning, right? So we make these sounds out of our mouth, and so the sender sends this out, and hopefully the receiver gets the impact of that meaning and interprets that sound, that symbol of sound, to make meaning. And reading is similar to that, except for it's an orthographic process, which is that you have to see a visual symbol and interpret it to make meaning. Okay? So the auditory symbols, that's something that we can look at and see, and we have brain processes for those. But do we have brain processes for interpreting visual symbols? That's the question. Or is it something that has to be taught? And if it has to be taught, then if somebody has a processing disorder, then that's where it's going to take effect. That's why reading is the largest area of disabilities of everything. You've got learning disabilities, the largest disability category, and reading is the largest of the special of learning disabilities. So that's an interesting thing. So let's move to the next. We're going to watch this video. You guys have a handout on your tables. I want you to grab this one. Okay. Y'all online, this is handout one, the phonemes and their spellings in several languages. You guys online, you have access to the handout. It's in your, let's get to there. Oh, I'm sorry. It's in at the content page of the class. If you guys are seeing this, go to the content page, module 3, down here at the bottom, you'll see SUSE handouts 1 and 2. So here, this is the one that you'll need to take notes on. We're going to fill out this kind of form as we watch this video, okay? So let's go to the YouTube and listen to Dr. Sousa speak.
Probably the most difficult thing we ask the young brain to do is to learn to read. Reading is a relatively new phenomenon in the development of humans. As far as we know, the genes have not incorporated reading into their coded structure, most likely because reading, unlike spoken language, has not emerged over time as a survival skill. Let's look at some of the problems the brain encounters when learning to read. It will help you understand why more students have difficulties with learning to read than with any other cognitive skill. Now, learning to read in English poses several problems that are peculiar to the English language. For example, there are more sounds in spoken English than letters to represent them, and their spelling is inconsistent. Here's an explanation. Now we're going to talk about how the brain learns to read, and can we go back to the very first statement I made at the beginning of the workshop? Do you remember that? When I stopped, fill in the missing word. Acquiring spoken language is a natural ability. Reading is, there are no reading areas of the brain. We have to co-opt areas of the brain designed to do other things in order to get it to learn to read. And that isn't easy. Now, it's particularly more difficult in English, surprisingly enough. Once again, of the 6,000 languages on this planet, English has two interesting characteristics that some people would say add to its richness, but also add to its difficulty in learning to read. Now, this poses some problems for kids whose native language is English, but poses enormous problems for kids whose native language is not English. What's the first one? The first one, remember what we got to do, and let me just stop for a moment and tell you what we're telling the human brain at this point. Now remember that when a kid comes to school for kindergarten, they have acquired a vocabulary, haven't they? They've been speaking since about 9 and 10 months of age. Hello? Right? Okay. Now how much of a vocabulary? Vocabulary is divided into two parts, active and passive. Active vocabulary is the words you use almost every day in normal conversation. Passive vocabulary are words that you know but you don't normally use, but you know the meaning of them. For example, prestidigitation. I don't use that word in normal conversation. I do happen to know it means sleight of hand. Magicians are prestidigitators. So I know the meaning of the word, I just don't use it. Okay? Now, when the average boy comes to kindergarten, he's got an active vocabulary between 2,000 and 3,000 words, and a passive vocabulary of 5,000 to 7,000. The average girl coming to kindergarten bumped those numbers up by 1,000. The average girl comes with 3,000 to 4,000 active and 6,000 to 8,000 passive. By the way, they speak it with 90% accuracy. They learn the syntax. They know to say, I want some candy. They don't say some candy I want. Because if they do, they don't get it. Try to correct it. And here's what we say to them. Boys and girls, you know those sounds that you've been jumbling around in your head for all these years? Guess what? I have a surprise for you. We have invented written symbols to represent those sounds. Isn't that interesting? What's the girl's brain saying? Ooh. What's the boy's brain saying? Oh, don't like where this is going. Now, the fun thing about those symbols is they don't exist in the real world. We made them up. And there's an itsy-weetsy little problem. Those sounds in your head that you use to speak English, you got about 44 of them. But we only have 26 symbols. So the itsy-bitsy problem is sometimes the same symbol can represent different, and sometimes the same sound can be represented by different. Isn't that cool? What I'm going to do is show you some common languages. How many sounds make up that language called phonemes, and how many ways you can spell those phonemes. How you represent a language in writing is called its orthography. Orthography means how you represent a language in written form. Let's take one of the easy ones, Italian. Italian has 33 phonemes, but only 25 ways to spell it. That's terrific. It means very few exceptions. Once you learn the rules of Italian spelling, there are almost no exceptions. I know a little Italian. My mother's side of the family was Italian. You hear an Italian word you've never heard before, you get about a 99.9% chance of spelling it correctly. If you spell it wrong, it's probably because the word was imported from another language, such as Arabic, for example. But the rules of Italian spelling are extremely reliable. Let me go to Spanish. Not too bad either. Spanish has a little over, has 35 or so, depending on the accent, and only 38 ways to spell them. Once again, rules of Spanish spelling are pretty reliable. Not quite as reliable as Italian, but pretty darn good. Languages like this, where there's a very close correspondence between the number of phonemes and how you spell them, are said to have shallow orthography. And they're very reliable. Now let's move to French. Only 32 phonemes in French, even less than Italian, but about 250 ways to spell it. And if you know some French, you know that can be spelled O-U, O-U-X, E-A-U, E-A-U-X, and so on. Now we come to English. Because English is a bastard language, and I mean that in a little bit, that is, it has borrowed words from so many other languages. It has 44. Actually, that number, that's the classic number, 44. Probably what you learned in college. It can go up to as high as 50 when you include some of the sounds from Australia, New Zealand, and other places where English is a native language, but spoken a little different from ours. How many ways do you think there are to spell that? They stopped counting after 1100. They just gave up after 1100. Now, these languages, like French and English, are said to have a deep orthography because the rules of spelling are very unreliable. We try to help out by coming up with these silly little phrases. I before E, except after, or sounded as A, as a neighboring way. What about the word science? A simple one-syllable word violates the rule. And so the challenges become enormous. Can you see why a kid whose native language is Spanish, who has already begun to write Spanish, gets thrown by English? Because Spanish kids rely, and Italian kids rely very much on their ear. When they hear it, they can spell it 99% of the time. In English, no. In order to understand how problems can arise when learning to read, we need to examine the parts of the brain that are involved during reading, as this.
Okay, so again, let's talk with your neighbor about that. What do you think? Is that an interesting thing? Those of you guys online, if you want to go to the chat and make some comments, that you can do that, and I'll pull it up. you can have make some comments there so we can engage you guys in that. So, now then, do you understand why most of us can't spell with a flip in English? Because we're going, oh my God, how do I spell that stupid word? And I get always, tear drives me nuts. T-I-E-R, and I flip the E and the I, with stupid things. I have dysgraphia, so that's even worse for me in a sense, but I can spell, thank God for spell check and grammar. But talk to your appropriately social distance neighbor about, so what does that mean for kids that are trying to learn to read if there's so many ways to spell the different sounds, and they already have trouble processing the language as it's coming into their brain anyway? How are they going to look at a word and understand? Is that going to be problematic? That's where we get the processing disorders. So the sounds, and you have the phonemes, and the phonemic awareness is being aware of the sounds. Phonemes is assigning the different sounds to the different orthographic pieces, etc. So talk to your neighbor about, what does that mean for students that you're going to be working with that are struggling with language? Is that going to be a problem? How are we going to fix this? Just talk for a minute. What do you think? Okay, 30 seconds, and we'll share a little bit. It's been an interesting thing. Okay, so share with me and share with the class your thoughts on what you were talking about. Anybody want to share? It's interesting, is it not? Why wasn't I born in an Italian family? I could spell. So let's listen. We're going to continue on because get out your second handout, the neural systems handout. And this is what Dr. Sousa is going to talk about. It's, if you scroll down on that handout online, guys, it'll be there. So we're going to listen to Dr. Sousa again, explain the neural systems that are associated with learning to read.
This next segment explains. There are 3 neural systems required to learn to read. First of all, you got to be able to see the word, and that's the visual processing system. It scans the letters. And that's processed, it's received in the back of the brain and then interpreted in the front of it. But scanned back here in the visual processing system, right back here in the occipital lobe. That's why you get whacked back here, you see stars and vision gets disrupted because that's where visual processing occurs. So you've got to see the letters D-O-G. When you do, you sound it out in your head. D-O-G. You attach the phonemes to the letters. Fancy names of the letters, graphemes. So you attach you see the letter D, you hear duh. You see the letter O, you hear in your head, and you see the letter G, you hear G. So when you read, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but when you read silently, you're sounding the words out in your head. Then, the next thing that happens is, Broca's area has to be activated. So, do you have this word there in your vocabulary? And Broca says, of course I do. I have that word dog. Well, let's go over to Wernicke. Wernicke, do you know what it means? Of course I do. So the visual processing system, the auditory processing system, the input from Broca and Wernicke are all put together and sent to the frontal lobe, whose job it is to understand what it means. First, you got to see it, sound it out, get the word, get the meaning, put it all together, come up with a picture of four animal parts. Complicated system. Now that we know the three neural systems involved in reading, we recognize what a complex process it really is and how easily things can go wrong. To master this process, we need to acquire certain skills as explained in this next segment. Okay. Kids come to school with one of these skills already. Kids have been speaking language without the benefit of reading. They've been processing those phonemes in their head. They recognize that different phonemes give different meanings to words. They recognize the difference between bat and pat and bet and pet, the different sounds. So they are already aware of the different phonemes. They come to school with that, and that all occurs, of course, in the auditory system. So they come to school with phonemic awareness. And that, of course, the degree, remember, phonemic awareness is a skill, so it runs a gamut. And the degree with which they have phonemic awareness will depend on the degree of exposure they've had to literacy at home. So some will have very poor phonemic awareness. They may not hear the difference between bet and pet or bat and pat. And some will have excellent, and then you'll have all the kids in between. Now, what we try to do with school is say, now we're going to match the sounds with the letters or the symbols that you see. So matching what you see to what you hear, matching the sounds to the symbols they represent, or the symbols to the sounds they represent, requires coordination between what you see and what you hear. That skill is called phonics. Now, seeing the word dog, hearing it in my head, will not produce the picture of a furry animal that barks unless I possess the word, right? And where do I have to possess the word? In Broca's, which is the seat of my V word, vocabulary. Where's Broca? Broca's part of the auditory system. You've got to possess the word. You can have all the phonics ability and phonemic awareness ability you have, but if you don't possess the word, you can't go any further. The more words you have in that vocabulary, the easier the process is. That's why we try to get parents, caregivers, to expose their kids to as much vocabulary as they can at the early years. But it's not just possessing the word, it's knowing what the word means. So that's the ability to interpret it, and that's called comprehension. Now, as you can see, for beginning reader, this is a cumbersome process. It takes a lot of mental effort. And so, like any new skill, the more you practice it, the easier it becomes, provided it's perfect practice and not let the kid go off on his own and guess at what it means. Because practice makes permanent. Permanent does not make perfect. Practice makes permanent. So you want to make sure that the practice is correct practice. So you want them to build up the speed with which that goes around. And the speed with which that occurs is called fluency. So it is no accident that when permanent does not make perfect, practice makes permanent. So you want to make sure that the practice is correct practice. So you want them to build up the
Okay, so look at that list real quick, and then we'll finish the video. Have you guys had training in the Big Five reading skills yet? Because all of you guys are reading teachers, you know that, right? Doesn't matter if you're elementary or secondary, you're going to be a reading teacher, and TEA requires you guys to know the Big Five and to how to implement them. So this is the science of reading. He just went through it very succinctly. These are the Big Five, correct? Phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary, comprehension, and fluency, the Big Five. These are brain processing pieces. And he said something really interesting. Practice makes permanent. Have you ever heard that before? You've heard practice makes perfect, right? Well, what happens if you're practicing incorrectly? Is it perfect? It's perfectly wrong, but it's permanent. So we've got to, in guided practice, when we look at the lesson cycle, we introduce a subject, we teach that subject, then we have guided practice over that subject, at that item, then they do independent practice, and then you evaluate to see if they got it or not, correct? And if they didn't, you go back to re-teach it and practice it differently until they get it. That's fluency. And we know that if you are a disfluent reader, your comprehension is horrible. So because you're struggling over putting the phonemic awareness, phonics pieces together to make meaning, and then you get stuck, and that's where the problem lies. So this is the science of reading, the Big Five. Okay, just wanted to touch base with that real quick.
Speed with which that goes around, and the speed with which that occurs is called fluency. So it is no accident that when two groups, two national panels, one directed by the National Research Council, one directed by the Department of Education, independently looked at the science behind learning to read, came up with the same conclusion, that in order for the human brain to learn to read and read successfully, it must have these 5 skills. So now we know that 5 important skills are required in order to learn to read successfully. Deficits in any one or more of these skills can lead to reading difficulties. For example, children who have few opportunities at home for extensive conversation will be weak in phonemic awareness, vocabulary, and comprehension. That's why it is so important for parents and teachers to expose young children to many literary forms and to engage them in conversation. Television is not an acceptable source of this conversation because there is no personal interaction to help the child understand what the words mean.
Branches brush. What do you think of that? Lightly, but what was something that the poets sometimes use? Branches brush. What do you say? Alliteration. Branches brush. It's sort of fun, isn't it? It's fun to say it. What is nonfiction? Who can tell me what nonfiction is? Right, and isn't it funny we say non, and yet it's true? Well, over the past 3, maybe 4 weeks, we've been writing about nonfiction, we've been reading nonfiction, and we've talked about the different kinds of nonfiction writings. There are, in fact, we have even written 2 different kinds. We've written the how-to, that was the first one we wrote, and we are now writing the all about, so we're writing about Egypt. And then soon we're going to be writing biographies. Who can spell authentic? Oh, let's see. Oh, the hard word, Kent.
Authentic.
Thumbs up if you think he's right.
It's easy.
Very good, which means real. Did it say she was angry? No. Listen, Rosa Parks did not yell or fight or cry on the bus or at her trial. She sat bravely and quietly. She sat bravely and quietly. Isn't in our question, doesn't calm mean the same thing? Sometimes that's what you have to look for. You have to look for words that mean about the same thing. And so that would be using the author's words and our scheme of what we know. We know that those words mean the same thing.
Let's say that together. I caught my naughty daughter in a cookie jar and taught her a lesson. Very good. Now open your spelling books and I want you to write the sounds you learned today. The ways to write the sound of awe, drawing the pictures.
We of course have to build background. We have to build some good phonetic approaches. We have to do a lot of phonemic awareness in second grade. But after we can get over that hump, we really try to develop just a definite interest in reading and stimulate their enthusiasm for reading. We try to give them a love for reading. And we I guess would say my goal is to make each of my students a lifelong reader.
These problems often continue into the upper grades where students are coping with course content. In that context, all teachers are reading teachers. And there are strategies that all teachers can use to help struggling older students with reading in the content areas. Here are 8. Use direct instruction. Explaining the content and checking for understanding verbally can often make the content easy to comprehend. Conquer vocabulary. Define difficult vocabulary words before the student encounters them in the reading. Help with comprehension. Explain the meaning of difficult concepts and try to connect them to what the student already knows. Rewrite content material. Just rewriting the content with simpler vocabulary can make a big difference in comprehension. Incorporate supplemental textbooks. Have on hand additional textbooks in which the content material is written at a lower grade level. Establish in-class vertical files. Many curriculum topics are often discussed in newspapers and popular magazines. Have these clippings on file as a supplement. Use audio-visual aids. A picture or video clip is worth 1,000 words. Use them often. Promote cooperative learning groups. This is still a very effective strategy for helping students of varying reading abilities learn the lesson content.
All right, so interesting, is it not, what Dr. Sousa has talked about? So, let's do a quick brain anatomy thing. If you look at the blue, this is from the frontal, there's a fissure right about here in your brain, right here. And forward, that's called the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is the last part of the brain to develop. It develops slower in boys than it does in girls. This is the area that we find with kids with ADHD that have much difficulty. And the frontal lobe deals with reasoning, planning, organizing, part-to-speech, movement, emotions, problem solving. It's kind of like, we call it the executive functions. It deals with all the very important functions in the brain. The first part of the brainstem down here, to develop is all your autonomic nervous system things, like your blood pressure, your heart rate, your breathing, those kind of things. Kind of maintain your system. So the frontal lobe is reasoning, planning, organizing, etc. The parietal lobe, that's the white area here, It's for touch, pressure, temperature, touching temperature, pain. So it's the tactile kinesthetic area of the brain. Then the temporal lobe, right here, the gray area, is auditory perception and auditory processing and recognition happens in that area. And then the occipital lobe, that's the red area of the brain, is the vision area of the brain. And so it interprets, that's where math is. Math is not a language-based process, it's a visual-based process. So math is seen in the visual cortex. So those are the lobes of the brain. And so to explain a little bit better what Dr. Sousa was talking about, let's say like I've got the picture of there, you've got an eye is your input device, and you're reading, right? And then you've got an output device is your mouth. So this information comes into the occipital lobe where you see it, right? And then it goes to the Broca's area, to I have, he was talking about that, into Wernicke's, and then it goes back out. So it's all those processes that go up in there. Eventually, if somebody has a problem with one of the processes, they're not going to be able to read. So we have it's kind of a chain of behaviors. So what does it mean, the semantics? What do I see, the orthography? And then what do I hear, the phonology? See how they all fit together to create fluency in students. So if the student has a problem with the phonology, that's an issue. Now, I think in your one of your introductory teaching classes, you talked about how poverty has affected kids' learning. There is a 1 million word deficit between kids from poverty and kids from middle class to upper class. They hear 1 million words less in their first 5 years of life. Do you think that's going to have an effect on their ability to process information? The problem is they never really catch up if they don't do it. And here's another thing. It's not only the deficit of words, it's the quality of words. I mean, you guys go to Walmart and you listen to parents talk to their kids, and you can tell the kids that coming from a disadvantaged home, and the interaction with parents there is significantly different than a parent from the middle class or upper middle class family. It's more commands and like stop, don't, quit, shut up, those kind of things, rather than coming home and how was your day at school? Do you see the difference? So it's a processing, it's another thing about making neural connections. If you have to open-ended questions cause you to go and get more information and make more connections, whereas closed-ended statements or questions don't. So we need to start creating those processes to get them engaging in their brain. So that's an important thing to think about. As I mentioned, here's the big 5 components of reading, exactly what Dr. Sousa had mentioned, and it's a puzzle. And if you don't have good phonemic awareness and good phonics, you'll have terrible fluency. You have to have automaticity of your phonics pieces to have good fluency. If you have poor fluency, your comprehension is shot. Right there. So we gotta do the perfect practice, and that's why dyslexia is a phonics-based disorder. It is not a visual disorder. All right, so we talked about dyslexia real quick. You guys have to do a training that you need to do, and you'll upload that, your certificate to TK20. But I just want to talk about dyslexia because there's so much mythology out there about dyslexia, but let's just kind of walk through it piece of it. Dyslexia is a disorder of, it's really a processing disorder of assigning the proper phonemes and phonic sounds to the symbols. That's really what it comes down to. This is the official definitions, so you can look through those and see, but it's interesting. This is a definition from the International Dyslexia Association. Dyslexia happens every language, every socioeconomic class, everywhere. So it doesn't fit to one group or another. So it is pervasive. These are the primary characteristics of dyslexia: difficulty reading real words in isolation, difficulty accurately decoding nonsense words, etc. Let's practice something. Okay, I want you to take the word hit. Okay, it's got 3 sounds, correct? Okay, now I want you to take the middle sound and replace it with a sound. And what word do you have? Okay, so you have hit, you remove the it sound, and replace it with an sound, and you got hat, right? Okay, kids with dyslexia, they can't segregate those sounds. How quickly did you do that? You were able to say, okay, it. I remove the it sound real quick. But kids with dyslexia, they can't. That's a telltale sign that they have a problem with the phonemes, right? So that's a big deal. And that's those being able to read those words in isolation, and so they have to. What they end up doing is they have to put the sounds together. It's like, this is how they would read. Hit, it. Okay, that means hit. It means hat. Something lying in your head. See how difficult that would be for you. So if we could just look at HIT and say, that's hit, that means you hit something or hit somebody or something like that, that's a quick, let's see how fluent we are. That makes more sense. So they have trouble, they also have difficulty learning the names of letters and their sounds that are associated with them, all 44 to 50 sounds. They have trouble with phonological memory, and that's what activity we did. They have trouble with rapidly naming items, like so if you look at a picture, they can't name the items real quickly, so that's an issue. This is some more common evidence of dyslexia. They may talk later than children. Most kids, they may have trouble with rhyming. They may also have trouble with skipping. Now you're saying, okay, how does skipping have anything to do with reading? It's muscle organization. And if you are not able to organize the muscles correctly, there's a processing thing going on in the brain, which then that's part of that whole processing and organizing in the brain information too. They may have difficulty pronouncing words like, they might say paschetti instead of spaghetti, or lawnmower for lawnmower, those kind of things. So that's why a speech therapist needs to be involved to know if it's a language thing or what. They may have, they don't do rhymes real well. They may have trouble acquiring vocabulary, all sorts of things. And then dysgraphia, they may have trouble with shapes and learning numbers and days of the week and those kind of stuff too. So, and dysgraphia is a related disorder to dyslexia. From kindergarten to third grade, this is what we see. They have trouble with decoding words. They have trouble with vocabulary. That's why it's really important to pre-teach vocabulary when you're teaching a new concept. So you pre-teach the vocabulary so that way they have knowledge beforehand. The disfluent reading, difficulty spelling phonetically, those kind of things are a big deal. Fourth grade on to high school, they probably don't like to read. They avoid reading out loud. They might become behavior problems if asked to read out loud. They might have a very inadequate vocabulary. They don't read for pleasure. Reading is probably my favorite thing to do in the world. And I probably read 200 books a year. Easily. And, but it's something I enjoy. So it's an interesting thing. But kids that have trouble with reading, they don't enjoy it, so they don't do it. They might enjoy graphic novels, which that's a good thing. They can break down and utilize the visual symbols here. Yeah. So very often, if we see, we might need to assess for dyslexia. That happens in Texas. We do have dyslexia assessment. It's usually a third grade non, but we can catch it earlier than third grade non. And this is just some stuff on the assessment of dyslexia. And it's cognitive processing disorders underlie the reading difficulty. Just like the psychological processes that we talked about earlier, those are the things that we see show up in dyslexia. With the next idea, reauthorization, we're going to see, most likely, dyslexia in the law as being a disability category, specific. And it's different than learning disabilities, but it is a learning disability. Okay. We have related disorders to dyslexia. Dysphagia is a delay in the development of comprehension, so it's a speech dysphagia. Dysgraphia, developmental spelling disability, developmental auditory imperception, those are all related disorders. And they go on under the dyslexia umbrella. So it's a phonics-based program, usually a Scottish Rite program that the school districts use for the students with dyslexia. It's a very structured phonics-based program that is there. So this is some more instructional pieces for the students with dyslexia. You can use a lot of visual cues in your classroom that will help. This is in your files. I want you guys to look through that. Well, on next week, on Thursday next week, Tuesday next week, we're going to talk about other health impairments. And then Thursday, we'll talk about emotional behavior disorders. But then we'll start getting into some instructional strategies for students with disabilities. Any questions? Good? Okay, so that's learning disabilities, basically. And so we will continue this discussion on the next disability category of other health impaired on Tuesday. Okay. If you contact me via email if you need anything, and we will talk to you all later.